I have long been after Bob to do a talk for us on Sansevieria. He's been very involved with Sansevieria in recent years and has learned a lot about them and is editing that wonderful journal about Sansevierias. And Sansevierias are a group that have become very popular in succulent circles. There was a time when people were dismissive of Sansevierias as being succulents because they were familiar with the Trifasciata types that aren't terribly succulent. But since then, so many ones that are marvelously succulent have come along that there is no question that they are a succulent. And not only that, but they have delightfully fragrant flowers and are very wonderful houseplants. So they have a lot going for them, and I look forward to learning some more. And Bob, take it away.
Thanks, Brian. My wife's here, so Tony, could you just lean in for a second?
There. Wow, I'm going to fall over. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Tony.
Here we are. We're both here tonight, so let me see if I can start this thing up.
Looks good.
Okay, everybody see that? Okay, I'm going to be giving a talk on the genus Sansevieria, and to answer Jorge, yeah, it's going to remain Sansevieria as long as I'm involved with this, and I'll give you reasons why in just a minute. It's a very diverse group of plants, and I'm going to be going through really the recent advances in the genus Sansevieria and what we know about it. So what we have always thought about it is things like this, which is Sansevieria Trifasciata, variety Laurenti, and it's known as the mother-in-law tongue or the snake plant. And a lot of people know about this thing, Sansevieria masoniana, which is known as the whale fin plant. And as my friend here will tell you, we don't know where these names are coming from, but we actually use Latin names for just about everything we do, and it's no different with Sansevierias. So a little bit of background first. The first Sansevieria described in science was by Linnaeus, who called Sansevieria, what's known as Sansevieria hyacinthoides, Aloe hyacinthoides, back in 1753. N.E. Brown, who never went to Africa, wrote the first systematic study of Sansevieria in 1915, and he was the guy that described most of the species that we recognize today. He described way more than what we recognize today, because a lot of what he was working with were so-called garden plants, various botanical gardens and private residences in Europe. Okay, so then genus sort of languished for a long time and came to be known as kind of this difficult thing, and so a lot of botanists really didn't want to deal with it. Until Horst Finnig came along in the 1980s, and Horst had a short but rather brilliant move on Sansevierias. He was German, and he described a couple of subspecies and did some things before he suddenly died. So he inspired a lot of people, though, one of whom was Juan Chahinian. Juan did a number of things, including starting a journal called the Sansevieria Journal, and he wrote 2 books on the genus Sansevieria, one on hybrids and one on the actual genus itself, as well as recently serialized in the journal that I edit, another piece on the cultivars. So along comes Alan Butler. Alan Butler at one point said that he had the national collection in the UK of Sansevierias and a few other things in a nursery called Brookside Nursery. He moved that nursery to Italy somewhere around 2005, I can't remember when, and currently is in Spain with Brookside Nursery. He started the International Sansevieria Society around 2001 and founded the journal Sansevieria, which is now at issue 43. So the current lineup for the International Sansevieria Society are these 2 guys. Alan Michael Bust over on the left and Bob Webb over on the right. Well, chairman, journal editor, we're kind of interchangeable at this particular point. But then there's this guy, Dr. Lynn Newton, who I've spent a considerable amount of time with in Africa. And as you'll see, the three of us have worked together considerably on the journal, and we've now put out 10 issues of the journal Sansevieria together as a group. And here's a couple of the more recent covers of that journal, Sansevieria. And the International Sansevieria Society is actually a growing society, which is a little bit surprising given how many plant societies have been languishing. We've really embraced the digital world and put out a lot of digital products, as well as a Facebook site and a hard copy journal, Journal Sansevieria. So I want to go after a few questions here. The first one is family that this belongs in. It's been in all of these various families at various times, and the one that we accept right now is the Dracaenaceae. It could change at any moment, however, because all of these families have been used at one time. Correctly addressing that question, should Dracaena and Sansevieria be combined into one genus, which would be the genus Dracaena because it's got historical precedence, or should they remain separate as separate genera of Dracaena and Sansevieria? Well, you know how I'm voting on that one right now, and I'll give you some information on it. Just as a little bit of background, the reason why somebody suggested that Dracaena and Sansevieria should be combined is because of some DNA work that was done that Q embraced. So Q has been pushing the combination of Sansevieria into Dracaena. So I want to just clear a few things up. That big thing right there in the center of the photograph, that's a Dracaena, not a Sansevieria. And that thing over there, well, that's a Dendrosychios. It isn't a Sansevieria either. And that's a Denium socatronum, which is not a Sansevieria either. And this guy's named Bob, and he's on Socotra a while back. And actually, there's no Sansevierias on the island of Socotra. I just threw that in because I like that photo. So what we've done is started to do some arrangement of this particular genus, and there's been a number of attempts to organize it, some of them aborted now. I'm assuming that genus Sansevieria will stand, so therefore I'm going to go with a subgenera classification, 3 of them. Subgenus Sansevieria, which currently has got 53 species in it, basically got an unbranched inflorescence, and the inflorescence is produced from apical meristem or from the ground. Now, somebody mentioned that they had a Sansevieria cylindrica that was about ready to flower. Well, they'll see that inflorescence coming from the apical meristem, and it's part of subgenus Sansevieria. Genus Capitatus, which right now has got 11 species in it, has a capitate inflorescence, or an inflorescence that more or less looks like a cap. It's produced very close to the ground, which suggests that the pollinators are things that are crawling around on the ground instead of flying through the air for the most part. Then the subgenus Paniculatus has 12 species. These are the big ones for the most part. The arborescent Sansevierias. Inflorescence is again produced from the apical meristem, but it branches, and that's a fairly critical characteristic. I'll be showing you examples of all of those. This is a map I produced a few years back showing the biogeography of the genus Sansevieria. So what you can see is that it's mostly southern hemisphere, although there are species over on the Indian subcontinent and in Myanmar. There's some species up on the Arabian Peninsula, but mostly it's off in the southern part of Africa. And the biodiversity hotspot is very definitely East Africa, which is where I've spent a lot of my time in Kenya and Tanzania. I wish I could spend time in Somalia, but I really don't want to get shot or blown up. But fortunately for those of us who work with this genus, there's a fellow by the name of John Lavranos that collected extensively in Somalia. And as a result of that collection, which we're trying to rebuild it now from in a diaspora, if you will, around the world, we're trying to collect various things that Avranos collected so that we can start describing some of them as species, or at least identifying them to species. So Alan Michael Bust and I created a living collection of Sansevieria inspired by Lynn Newton. And it's in Tucson, Arizona. And it's a collection that's doubled up so that we don't lose anything. We spent a lot of time putting this together. And the big thing about this is that it has many plants with collection data, including plants from type localities. So if we're going to actually make a serious study of this genus, we've got the goods to do it with. So it allows character comparisons among these living plants so that we can actually start putting things together into subgenera, for example. It's also essential for DNA analyses, which is the ultimate goal of this collection. So I've dabbled with DNA work with a couple of collaborators, and it's been a very frustrating experience, which is why I'm very dubious about somebody with a minimal amount of data declaring that Sansevieria should be subsumed under Dracaena. Anytime you've got a rapidly evolving genus, such as Sansevieria, a low variability in DNA among the various species involved. I found this to be true in agave as well as in Sansevieria. And we know, though, that Sansevieria is distinct from Nolina and Dracaena based on our initial work with DNA on 1,500 base pairs. So we've got a good start on that. It also indicates support for that subgenus Paniculatus, the arborescent species. So again, it's showing that it's not just a fluke that's going on here. And we've been seeing new plants all along to really start to think about revising this whole genus and really determining the answer to that question of whether Dracaena and Sansevieria belong in the same genus. It's an interesting twist because those of you who know your succulent plants realize that the genus Aloes recently was split, I think, into 4 parts. Haworthia was split into 2, and here we're trying to merge 2 together. So there's all these different approaches, and it really comes down to what do you think, what do you believe is the case? Because there's no mathematical equation or any amount of data that's ultimately going to stop somebody from issuing an opinion on whether or not genera should be merged or should be broken apart. So with that speech out of the way, let's look at some plants. If you are not familiar with the genus Sansevieria, and I mean really familiar with it, and what I'm going to show you in the next few slides could be a fairly big surprise, because we have a really wide variability in forms of Sansevieria. Everything from acaulescent shrubs, little things close to the ground, to sizable arborescent things, not as arborescent as typical Dracaenas, but still fairly large plants. Some of them, like the one on the left, are very broadleaf and thin. Brian Kimball brought up that issue earlier in his introduction. Some of them are like javelins, like Sansevieria fisheri over on the right. The tallest one of those, by the way, is about 6 feet tall, and we found one in the wild that was 8 feet tall. So, and it's cylindrical. So there's a great morphological diversity in this genus. Okay, so this hyena is going to remind me that I need to go back to the beginning of this talk for a second and look at the mother-in-law tongue. And this it's one of the most widespread succulent plants in the world. It's kind of funny because when I'm watching movies and television shows, I frequently see these things in offices in the background of a scene. It's kind of funny to see all these Sansevierias that are actually in movie sets. So Sansevieria Trifasciata, one of the most common plants out there. Well, we found something in Tanzania. This was Barry Yenger and Robert Sakawa were wandering around Sansevieria trying to map Sansevierias in Tanzania. And they found this thing, which I named for them, Sansevieria Trifasciata subspecies Sakawe. So this makes the third of the subspecies of Trifasciata. It's really characteristic of that flower inflorescence in the middle. The stalk is zigzaggy, which I've never seen in a Sansevieria before. It's also kind of this yellow-green, which is also quite uncharacteristic for a Sansevieria. So we have a new Sansevieria Trifasciata out there that we've named. So if you look at the Trans-Africa distribution of Sansevieria trifasciata, it was originally described from being native to southern Nigeria, and here we found it all over Tanzania. So maybe there's a whole lot more in between. And as a plant taxonomist that likes to look at things in the wild, this becomes an issue because what's in between are a bunch of countries with civil wars and Ebola. And so I don't really think I'm going to be going to any of those countries anytime soon. So it just shows you the difficulty that you have when you're trying to work in a continent like this with a divergence of countries and a divergence of landscapes, trying to make sense of genera that is this widespread and this diverse. We continue on. Lynn and I have made a point of, when we're together in Africa, going to type localities where we can figure out where something actually was originally described. And in this case, we're near Kampala, Uganda, and this is Sansevieria dawii. Dawii is known in collections as kind of a pattern thing, and here it is almost entirely solid dark green at its type locality with a kind of bristly shaving brush type inflorescence. But when you go to these localities and you collect specimens, remember we're trying to do this for DNA work, actually get the original plant from the original type locality, as well as to actually get a good look at the variability in the wild. Well, that plays to this thing, which is Sansevieria nilotica. Sansevieria nilotica originally was described in northern Uganda, and in the southern part of Uganda, quite near to where Sansevieria dawii is found, Frati obscura was described as a type locality for Sansevieria nilotica. But when we found it at that type locality, boy, it didn't look any different from the typical species. So we're wiping that variety out. So as part of our reorganization of this genus, if you will, we're combining things, we're describing new species, and we're also eliminating things from the literature on this genus. So it becomes a real challenge because of the variability in the wild. There's a big industry revolving around Sansevieria and cultivation that has all these things. If you look at the bats, for example, the bats being Sansevieria hallei and its cousins from the Zimbabwe area. There's blue bats, there's pink bats, there's giant bats, there's small bats. There's all these things that are out there. Well, wait a minute. Somebody should look at the field variability of this, because here's Sansevieria fisheri, and those two are Sansevieria fisheris, and that's Sansevieria fisheri. So are these really all Sansevieria fisheri, or should this species be broken up into a number of subspecies? At the present time, I don't think so, but it raises an interesting question. How much variability can be tolerated in the concept of a Sansevieria species? And that same question can be raised about anything, such as an aloe, such as a haworthia, such as a cactus. So we're fighting the same battles with Sansevieria that everybody fights when they're dealing with taxonomy. So I want to go back to that species that Linnaeus described back in the 18th century, Sansevieria hyacinthoides. Sansevieria hyacinthoides is very common in South Africa. This is the type locality near Uitenhage, near Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape Province. It forms these really massive stands. They're very dense, and if you get into there, you can see what the thing looks like. So a little narrow leaf species, a bit of patterning on it, very flexible leaf. Well, the problem with the South Africans, or some of the South African botanists, is they could care less about genus. So here you have Sansevieria hyacinthoides over on the left with its smooth and flexible leaves, and this other thing over here on the right has been mapped as Sansevieria hyacinthoides. It has stiff leaves, and the undersides of those leaves are very rough. So there's clearly some work to do in South Africa, and I've been attempting to do just that. Starting with another one that's very common in South Africa and Namibia, Sansevieria aethiopica. Now, Ethiopica, as you might imagine, that actually implies that it's up from the Horn of Africa. This is part of the problem with describing plants from garden collections. Locality information gets lost. But these two things are Sansevieria aethiopica, and they look quite different. They were found within 1 kilometer of each other in Namibia. So it kind of, again, illustrates the degree of variability that one gets. And then this fellow over on the left, his name is Gerard Marx. I have a real hard time pronouncing his Afrikaans name. But Gerard is a world-renowned botanist and artist. And he found this little thing, the place where he was looking for a euphorbia. It's a dwarf Aethiopica, which stays dwarf. So one of these days, if I can ever get this thing to flower, it'll be subspecies Marxii, because it's considerably different and out of the range of typical Aethiopica. So yeah, this leopard almost fell on us when we were parked under that tree. And he's reminding me that it's kind of late at night. So I'm going to be kind of going through a few things a little faster here. And what I want to look at is this group of plants, which is a group of cylindrical stemmed Sansevieria, which I would call the Sansevieria Fruticosa complex. Fruticosa is one of the more common plants in Kenya. It actually has a range up into Ethiopia and into Tanzania. This is the type locality near Gilgil, Kenya, where Lynn took me one trip. So I'm going to go through this complex and look at a few plants. So here's one of the rarer Sansevierias around. This is Sansevieria ilensis in cultivation. This is Sansevieria balii, which Lynn Newton described. And here's a close-up of it. It's a small cylindrical leaf species, and it's about ready to flower there. This is another one that Lynn described, Sansevieria bella, near its type locality in southwestern Kenya. And here you can see it, a planted situation in Uganda, where it looks like it earns its name because of all those really beautiful bandings on it, make it a really bella species. This is one I found south of Lake Naivasha in Kenya, Sansevieria labifolia. I paid this little girl a couple of rand to hold that thing up so that you can see just how big it is. Lynn came up with the name labifolia, which means smooth leaves. Most of the members of this group have very rough leaves. This one's an exception, it has smooth leaves. So I'm going to lay them out for you here. This is the Sansevieria Fruticosa complex, starting with the largest leaf plants and going smaller and smaller and smaller with time on this graph. Sansevieria ilensis being the smallest leaf species. I've also color-coded this. That yellow species down there, Sansevieria labifolia with the largest leaves, that's one I described with Lynn Newton. There are two of them in there that are kind of a light green color, bella and balii. Lynn Newton described those within the last 15 years. And then there's three of them with light blue coloration, Isolima, Hargesana, and Ilensis, which Juan Chahinian described. But more than half of this group has descriptions that date within the last 20 to 25 years. So it's a situation where we're rapidly increasing our knowledge of this particular genus and these groups of plants as well. This is one I've been working on, although I have not been to see most of this in the wild. Sansevieria cancina is flagship of what you can call a spoonleaf species, again showing the diversity of this genus. The species that John Lavranos collected a number of plants on from Mozambique. And it was originally thought that this species only occurred in Mozambique. And then people like Ernst von Jaarsveld came along and started collecting things in South Africa. And all of a sudden, a picture emerges of a species, red dots there, distributed mostly along the coast of Mozambique and into South Africa, with a few outliers, one in Zimbabwe that I found an herbarium specimen for. And then this thing the arrow is pointing at. It's at a place called Sudwala Caves in Mpumalanga province of South Africa. Tony and I went there and asked people if they had seen this plant, and they said they had no idea what we were even talking about. But it's in cultivation and it's flowering over there on the left. And I've named that one subspecies sudwalensis to reflect its relationship with the Sansevieria cancina group. Now, this becomes a very interesting thing because here's the murderer's row, if you will, Sansevieria cancina. On the far left, this little dwarf thing, that was collected by Ernst von Jaarsveld, and it stays dwarf, it's a cancina. The next one over from the left, that's another one that Ernst von Jaarsveld collected in South Africa. It's a typical leaf size. And then the third one over, that's the dwarf species that John Livranos collected in Mozambique. The middle, the big one that John Livranos collected in Mozambique. The thing in the very center, that's Sudwalensis. Then the thing with the big pot there, all those leaves, that is something that was called Lake Sabaya in the trade. And now I put that into cancina as well. And then that thing over on the right. Over on the right is Sansevieria subspicata. As it turns out, it's the least well known of this whole group of plants. And yet people were trying to lump all of these things into Sansevieria subspicata. Well, we've reversed that one. We're going to keep cancina on its own because subspicata is a different animal all on its own. And it's so limited in distribution around Maputo, Mozambique, that we really think that one deserves its own study. That's spoonleaf complex. I'll go to the arborescent group of plants. This is Sansevieria arborescent. It's something that had been known in cultivation for a long time, dating way back before N.E. Brown. Well, Lynn Newton came along. He started finding some other things and big differences here. And he described Sansevieria ascendens, or what he calls in his British accent, Sansevieria ascendens. Here it is in flower. I finally managed to flower the thing in Tucson this winter. And what you see there is inflorescence that's candelabrum-like. It's very much upright, curving upwards. That's how it gets its name, ascendens, and why it's different from arborescence, which has flowers. The secondary flowering peduncles are out at right angles. So look at those little bitty tiny flowers. This is the subgenus Paniculatus. And I noticed something here. The fellow over on the left is somebody that is very important to the world of Sansevieria. His name is Wire Batala. We'll get back to him in just a minute. But he found this thing in the center, which I couldn't understand what it was until it flowered, and noticed the upwardly curving flowers, the really tiny flowers. It's an ascendens. I called it variety Wire after Wire Batala with Lynn Newton. And again, the funny little flowers that this thing's got, it's really kind of strange how the sepals are very, very short. One of the plants that has again been really misunderstood by people is Sansevieria bagamoyoensis. Lynn, Tony, and I went on a trip to Tanzania and went to Bagamoyo, Tanzania, searched around, and by golly, we found it in the bush. Really difficult to find because it's really deep in the bush and it hides really well, but there it is. It's a unique thing that is deserving of its own species status. Lynn, in his attempt to unravel all of these arborescent things, described something called Sansevieria demitassens. And it's really unique from both ascendens and arborescens because those leaves are flexible and you can really bend them quite a bit, and they're relatively wide as well. So again, we're getting a little bit of attraction in on these arborescent things. One of the interesting things going on ethnobotanically in Africa is trying to figure out who eats what, especially when there's troubled times. Elephants actually eat Sansevierias during drought periods. So it is a desperate situation, food supply for them. So we know that now, and a number of other animals also use Sansevierias for everything from weapons to tools. I want to go to another complex of plants that was misunderstood quite heavily and we're trying to now unravel it. It spans a great bit of Africa. Here it goes from these red circles, originally thought to go from Oman all the way down to southern Tanzania and into Uganda. This is the Sansevieria Ehrenbergii complex. And we've been trying to unravel this one for a while, and we're making some headway on it. Let's go to Yemen first. So this is one of those mountain towns in Yemen that's quite well known for the sort of gingerbread structures and skyscraper type appearance. And it's around these that you find Sansevieria Ehrenbergii. The species was described from the Sudan, coastal Sudan actually, right across the Red Sea from Yemen. Here it is in various places. And what you can see about this is it's a fan-shaped Sansevieria with nearly cylindrical leaves, very stout leaves, they're dangerous leaves actually. They're very pointed. So over in Oman, there's another thing that's hanging out. And this was the first selection of plant that Tony and I saw in Africa or in that part of the New World anyway. Just driving up from Salalah and found these groups of plants that were at that time known as Sansevieria Ehrenbergii. But John Lavranos and Tom McCoy recently described it as Sansevieria dopharica, and my hat's off to them for doing that because it's well deserved. This is what it looks like, and it's very different in cultivation from Sansevieria Ehrenbergii from Yemen. Then things started flowering of these Lavranos plants, and Lavranos 23295 flowered out, and it's obviously in the subgenus Paniculatus because of that branching inflorescence. And we called it Sansevieria Lavranos after John Lavranos. And I wanted to get a little bit broader on it, but this particular plant was found in the vicinity of Mogadishu, Somalia, just north of Mogadishu, a place that I'll probably never go in my lifetime. But I have been to coastal Kenya, and another thing grows there that was mapped and called Sansevieria Ehrenbergii. That's Patricia Poes. We'll get her late husband in a few minutes here. And it's on the Poes farm called Suyan on the Laikipia Plateau in Kenya. This plant in cultivation is very common in coastal Kenya and was mapped as Ehrenbergii, but I'm calling it Sansevieria lavrani now after John Lavranos. In the southern part of Tanzania, there was a type locality for a very poorly known species, Sansevieria peroti. That guy, Wiri Batala, that I introduced a few minutes ago, we got him to go down and find it. And sure enough, right there on the shore of the Indian Ocean in a cove at the town of Lindi. Lindi is an old seaport in southern Tanzania. And that's where this species was described by botanists who got off a ship and found it immediately. It's a very different thing than anything else in this complex. It deserves its own species status. And then there's again Patricia Poes over there on the right. Wilfred Poes went up north of the Marsabit in Kenya, and he found this thing, which again looks like Sansevieria Ehrenbergii, the way it was originally thought to be, but it's clearly another thing altogether. And we have this in cultivation now in Tucson, and are just simply waiting on it to flower in order to figure out where it fits in the great scheme of things. But the one thing's for sure, when you look at all those circles that I showed you before, we've got a different picture emerging now. Number one, that's where Sansevieria Ehrenbergii is, with a greatly reduced distribution. Sansevieria dopharica is up there in Oman. Sansevieria lavrani is in coastal Kenya and Somalia. Sansevieria peroti is down in southern Tanzania. And Sansevieria marxibitensis is in between, kind of spanning the group. So we're breaking this group up into things that make a whole lot more sense taxonomically. I'll go into a few more things that are related to this group. Sansevieria robusta is very common in the Rift Valley of Kenya and Tanzania. We'll get back to it at the end of this particular talk, but it's a group, a species that forms these really large stands that are impenetrable, very, very sharp leaves. Sansevieria pearsoni has a wide distribution all the way from northern Namibia over into Zimbabwe. Again, it's a fan-shaped species that has very, very sharp stems on it. It was described a long time ago. Cylindrica up in northern Angola is in the same group. As is this is Sansevieria volkensii, and over there on the right, that's the type locality near Same, Tanzania. So we went and collected this particular species, and the process found a variegated form of Sansevieria volkensii, which is a very, very nice species. Unfortunately, when it goes into shade, it tends to revert back. But you take it out into the sun and it goes white again. But what's interesting about this guy, I've been mentioning his name, and here he is, Guilfred Poes. Guilfred was a friend of ours. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, he was trampled by an elephant and was killed on his ranch at Suyan in the Laikipia Plateau. Guilfred was a rancher and an epic explorer, a very, very incredible guy who has a Ceropegia named after him, an aloe named after him, and a Sansevieria named after him. So he collected a lot of stuff, and on his farm, he had another living collection that he established of plants that he found. And over there on the right is something that Lynn Newton described from a collection that Guilfred made. He called it Sansevieria brevifolia. I think it's actually a dwarf form of volkensii, and DNA work may prove that out at some point. But whatever, it's a very interesting species that stays dwarf. And then among the other things on Guilfred's property is this thing, the Sansevieria malabensis. At least it will be if we can ever get the thing formally published. Again, collected by Guilfred Poes on the Ethiopia-Kenya border. There's a big epic story about that whole thing, about how he was held captive for a month because of invading Ethiopia. But anyway, he brought the plant back and planted it. The reason it's not described is because the holotype herbarium specimen rotted in the East African herbarium, so we've got to replace it. And in the time of COVID, traveling to East Africa is not exactly an easy thing to do. So right now, this is currently still an undescribed species. So some of these species are a little cryptic, sort of like this lioness, and some of them are pretty out there in your face. And what he's asking is, why do we keep describing new species? They all look the same, don't they? Well, no, they don't. And I think that's part of the lure of this, and why it was so frustrating to botanists for so many decades, is because there's the differences among these species are pretty small in the great scheme of things compared to, say, the genus Aloe or the genus Euphorbia. But along come some things that really make you step back and listen and think when you find them. Wiri Batala found a plant in central Tanzania. And there's Wiri holding his plant. And Lynn Newton and I described this as Sansevieria batale. Wiri found it, and we've been mapping this thing now, Barry Yinger and I, around various parts of Tanzania. It turns out it's one of the more widely distributed species in Tanzania. Here it is, showing a very large form of it. These stems are upwards of 3 to 5 feet in height. And, well, there's something in cultivation that used to be called superclone. It was something that Grigsby introduced out of the Grigsby Cactus Garden in Vista, California. I put that into Sansevieria batale as well. So we're actually solving some mysteries, putting these plants together. And just for yuck's sake, I decided to throw in this variegated Sansevieria batale. Wiri Batala gave a leaf of this to my wife, Tony, and we've been growing it ever since, and it turns out it's rather vigorous. I also should point out that one of the things about Sansevieria batale, which is striking, is that it's dimorphic. It has juvenile leaves, which are basically flat lying against the ground, and then it starts throwing up those really tall adult leaves like superclone. So it's if you didn't realize that by seeing it in the wild and seeing these things growing together, you probably do what people in cultivation have been doing. They've been calling this silver blue. They've been calling this all kinds of things, super clone, without really understanding how it all fits together. Tony and Lynn and I were approaching the Kenya border in Tanzania, driving north, and those of you who have been to overland immigration stations realize there can be a long wait. So we decided to take a little rest stop right south of the border. And we got out of the car and all three of us went in different directions. And I went behind this acacia and found this right in front of me. And this thing is something that we described as Sansevieria intritifolia. Lynn and I thought that it was more appropriate to call it intritifolia, which means handy dagger, because it's a very stiff, very pointed leaf species. And here it is in Tucson flowering. And those are those flowers which have really highly exerted filaments and anthers, as well as the really strongly recurved sepals on the flowers. Very, very highly scented, as Brian pointed out. Some of these species just are extremely fragrant when they're flowering at night. So this rhino's kind of a wise ass, and he's saying, yeah, he's seen it all and everything, and we've been trying to train the wildlife to find all these plants for us and document their GPS locations, but they're kind of not into that very well. But Barry Yinger's been into that, and he now has found that Sansevieria intritifolia is a whole lot more widely distributed than I ever thought it was. I thought it was actually very uncommon, but he's found a number of localities in northern Tanzania now. So extensive field work, as well as describing these things as new species, is really yielding some results. I want to go through the Sansevieria elliptica complex now. You've seen wide-leafed plants already in this talk. And elliptica is a species from coastal Kenya that has undersides of leaves that are kind of rough, and they're relatively stiff, but not overly stiff. And there's an elliptica in flower, showing kind of that shaving brush type of a flower situation. It's common in the subgenus Sansevieria. So the first one I want to talk about is something that was collected originally, we think, by Juan Chehenian, although it's, not by Juan Chehenian, by John Lavranos, although the number on it is sufficiently obfuscated that we don't know what actual number it was. But the species came in through Ernst Speck's out of Exotica Nursery in Germany. We got a hold of it. It's a very slow growing single leaf species, maybe 2 leaves at the most. We decided after it flowered to name it for Juan Chehenian. So the Sansevieria cheheniani is something that I described with Alvin Michael thus. There it is in flower. It's a very rare, very expensive, very slow growing plant. And it's from Isle Somalia, and also the location of Sansevieria islensis. That's also where the pirates were out taking over oil tankers and yachts and things in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So it's a very dangerous place. I doubt I'll ever go there. But I would really like to, because it's a really beautiful species that was found up on a plateau above the town. I just mentioned Ernst Speck's. Ernst and Marita Speck's were in Benin, heading overland, going towards the Ivory Coast, happened to take one of those rest stops and happened to find this thing, which is a broadleaf Sansevieria with rough leaves and very stiff leaves. It's very unlike anything else in West Africa. It flowered for us, and so Alan and I named it Sansevieria speckii after Ernst Speck's and Marita Speck. The thing that's really interesting about this is that the sepals on it just shred. It's amazing. They just shred and hang down like little filaments off of the inflorescence. Very unique among the genus Sansevieria. Wiri Batala, an intrepid explorer from Tanzania, told us about this thing that he found and showed it to us in his nursery. And then on another trip, took us to Ngari Nanyuki, Tanzania, which is just north of Mount Meru in Arusha National Park. Here it is flowering in his nursery, and unfortunately I didn't do anything with this at the time. This was at least 15 years ago, and flowered in my nursery at home here about a year ago. And so we were able to describe it as Sansevieria rugosifolia. It's named rugosifolia because it's rough on both sides of the very stiff leaves. So it's different from Sansevieria elliptica. It's also a completely different shape from Sansevieria elliptica. Lynn had this thing in his backyard in Nairobi. It just bugged him for years. Arturo Foresti, who was a scientist in Nairobi, gave it to him a long time ago, and Foresti died, but he left some 3x5 cards that sort of indicated that it was from southwestern Kenya. And so Lynn and I took off one day on one of our trips and went out to find it, and sure enough, we did. And there it is flowering. So this was described by Lynn and I as Sansevieria foresti. Again, another different thing. When it's in the shade, it's almost, leaves turn almost black. Out in the sun, it's a more highly patterned thing than when it's in the shade. Then back to Wire Batala. In Wire's travels, he came across this thing, which he found at Lake Eyasi, Tanzania. Wire took us there, but we could not relocate the plant. And if you look really closely at the center of it, you realize it's starting to flower. And this photo was taken 2 days ago here in my nursery in Tucson. So just today, I'm arranging for Wire Batala to go find this thing again so we can determine its fate, whether it deserves to be a new species of Sansevieria or whether it should just be part of something else in the Sansevieria elliptica complex. Both Alan Michaelbust and I think this really deserves its own species status. So I want to just sort of finish this up by giving a slide that I would use if I was talking here in Tucson, which I've given this talk in Tucson before. Sansevierias in Tucson are reasonably easy because it's so warm here. It's close to the same kind of a climate prior for most species, but same kind of climate as in subtropical Africa. We just stick them in the ground. And Michaelbust has got 20 species that can take our freezing down to about 20 degrees. So some of them are actually frost hardy. We grow them in pots with typical cactus mix. We like to grow them in the shade because that's what they like to be, where they like to be in the wild. And they are ideal houseplants, which is why you see them in all those television shows and movies. So with Sansevierias, most people do not understand that it's generally about the roots, not about the leaves. And you have to give the roots room. So you oftentimes see Sansevierias being grown in what looks like oversized pots. If you don't do that with Sansevieria masoniana, for example, it'll break the pot. I've had that happen to me, even though putting them in the 20 and 30 gallon pots. So it's kind of important to give them room. You water them typically less than most succulents, particularly in the winter months, which means it's not going to do well with winter climates in California where it's cold and wet. They'll have to be protected from the winter rain in California. But the great news is that there's very few pests to bother them unless you're in, say, South Florida, where various fungi to make their home on Sansevierias and kill them. So I want to just kind of finish this up with looking at these guys out on the Serengeti trying to eat things and go to a place called Olduvai Gorge. Olduvai Gorge is known as the cradle of humanity. It's in northern Tanzania, near the Kenya-Tanzania border. Leakeys, Lewis and Mary Leakey, found a number of hominid skeletons in this particular gorge, which is why it's considered the cradle of humanity. There's a little problem. The problem is that the Maasai own this land. The Maasai refer to this place as the Olduvai Gorge. Olduvai refers to Sansevierias, which is Sansevieria robusta, shown in a big mob scene right in front of you in this photograph. So I would submit that since the cradle of humanity is also the cradle of Sansevierias, we're all descended from Sansevierias. Thank you very much.
Wow, great, Bob. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Do you mind taking a few questions if anybody has questions? Or
Not a problem.
let's see. I saw one that was in the chat from Jorge, and he asked, and I don't know if this was about that specific one that you were showing at the moment or just in general, but can you describe the typical fragrance of the flowers? There was one that you were talking about, the fragrance, and I think that's when you mentioned it.
When I can't remember which one that flowered in my kitchen, it actually drove me completely crazy with allergies. A very, very sweet, sickly sweet smell that just completely filled the entire house. That's kind of the most fragrant one that I've come across. Some of them, like the Ascendants and the Sansevieria, when those flowered, they had almost no smell whatsoever. So I think it's something that's characteristic of the subgenera of Sansevieria, that plants in the subgenera Sansevieria, which are solitary inflorescences, they tend to have the really fragrant flowers, and I think the other ones don't. But it can just be overwhelming. And also, you need to keep in mind that probably from an evolutionary perspective, flowering period when they open for pollinators varies considerably. Some of them are early evening, some of them are early morning, and some of them are midday. So clearly they're trying to attract different kinds of pollinators.
I have a question, Bob. I want to know what this Sansevieria is. May be difficult to say because it's probably a juvenile form, but the leaves are quite scalloped at the edge and have a sort of red and white border, and the leaves are extremely thick, 3/4 of an inch thick. And I thought from the pictures I saw in your presentation that maybe it was a juvenile Betale. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
That would be my shoot from the hip. Yes, that's a Betale juvenile form. There's a number of different forms of Betale that are out there. And as we're learning that the range of that species is much wider than I ever thought when I originally described it. Yeah, there could be something. Joaquin Ida from Germany said he found Betala in Malawi. So that thing that you've got there that you just showed, it could be from anywhere.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you.
We had a question in the chat from Julia. She said, as a young genus, I wonder if you can speak to the probable impact of natural hybrids on your identification efforts.
You know, it's really funny. There was a period of time in looking at Sansevierias where people were just, everything's a hybrid. They were trying to just go with just a few species, and that things like Sansevieria powelli, for example, oh, that's a hybrid. And Sansevieria prote, oh, that's another hybrid. Bagamoya, oh, another hybrid. You know what? I think the DNA work is going to ultimately shed some light on that. I'm also trying to get somebody interested in the ploidy levels, the chromosomes, because that clearly can separate out the men from the boys, if you will, when it comes to hybrids versus real species. So we're making an effort on that one. At this particular point in time, it's early days in Sansevieria taxonomy, which seems funny since it first dates all the way back to Linnaeus. But we're finding so many more new things that are really starting to make this a much more interesting genus than just Sansevieria Trifasciata.
Hey, Bob, I got a Sansevieria when I was in Hawaii from Nathan Wong called Rorida. Is that a good species?
Yeah, it is. It's not as well known as I think it needs to be. There's a whole bunch of, there's a Rorida, and then there's a bunch of Roridas that John Lavranos collected. In fact, I showed a photograph I showed of Marsabatensis. That could well be an oversized version of Rorida. That's one of the things I'm going to be looking at, is comparing that one when it flowers to Sansevieria Rorida, which is a valid species from Somalia.
Okay.
Well, we had a lot of other questions in the chat. Let me see if I can get to a couple of them here. Let's see. Thoughts on the relations between Sansevieria and Dracaena, which I think you kind of covered. So you don't think that they're intermingled in terms of common ancestor? From your point of view, they're separate enough that you keep them separate.
Yeah, I'm 100% sure that on the evolutionary tree, they're very closely related. There's no question about that. Right. It really comes down to philosophy here. Do you want to go with a Linnaean type of organizational structure to your taxonomy, which is heuristic in nature, where you're trying to understand things and group things according to readily identifiable characteristics? Most Dracaenas are big trees. Most Sansevierias are fairly small. That alone should separate. However, the school of thought in taxonomy today is very confused, because now you've got dendroaloes and you've got aloes. You're separating on the basis of morphology instead of sexual reproduction. Well, if you look at Dracaena versus Sansevieria, seeds are quite different in Dracaenas than they are in Sansevierias. I've got a pile of Dracaena Dracos in my living room right now. Seeds, they don't look like any Sansevieria seeds I've ever seen. So if you look at it from a Linnaean perspective of reproduction first, I think you can clearly separate them, and I think DNA is going to do that too.
Okay. So somebody asked something, and I don't even know how to pronounce it, but I'm going to give it a try. Dante asked, how do you deal with sans and anthracnose? Do you know what that is, or am I mispronouncing it, or maybe?
Oh, not even a clue.
Dante, you're gonna have to explain what you mean on audio or in the chat if you want an answer to that. Here's another one. How much variation is there in the inflorescences within a population or a species?
That's a really excellent question, because one of the problems with Sansevierias is they really don't flower very often, so we don't have enough information out there to build a variability. I would really like to do some multivariate analyses of just what you said, of the various flowers among these species, to see if you can separate them statistically from one another. It's almost impossible because they don't flower very much. I waited 11 years for Sansevieria intritifolia to flower. I waited 15 years for Sansevieria rugosafolia to flower. You can't wait that long and develop the statistical basis that would be needed to address that question. Excellent question, however. I wish I could.
John Gamesby, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? You're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I have a specs plant, ES22547, which flowered first time for me last year. It's one of the Tanzanian ones from south of Tabora. Now, I don't know whether you can share the screen. Let me share the screen so I can put a picture up.
While he's doing that, Jorge flashed up a question there about how to get Sansevierias to flower. I have no clue, but I will tell you right now, this winter I'm having one of the best Sansevieria blooms I have ever had. So we have multiple possible new species candidates that are blooming in our living collection. I don't know what we did. It's been a dry summer and a dry winter. Maybe drought had something to do with it, but certainly no amount of fertilizer I'm dumping on things or amount of water is doing anything for that. Jesse Reimer's now saying that a lot of flowering is occurring nationwide, so maybe we're having a masting event for Sansevierias that are going off because of whatever reason. Nobody really understands masting events in native shrubs in the southwestern U.S. I think we understand even less in something like Sansevieria.
Are there any intrageneric hybrids? That was like my other question.
Oh yeah, one of the things that Horst Finnig did was cross Arborescent and Ehrenbergii. So I've got that hybrid out there. There's another one that's a hybrid that somebody made from a John Lavranos plant and Consena, I think, and it's known as Balthasar. So yeah, there's a number of intergenetic hybrids.
What about intergeneric?
Oh, you mean between Dracaena and Sansevieria, for example?
Yeah.
I don't know anybody that's tried that. Maybe I could do a Dracaena Draco versus a Sansevieria. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah.
A cylindrical leaf Draco. That'd be pretty cool.
That'd be pretty weird.
So John Gamesby, no luck with your.
He's got it there, I think.
I've got it as a background. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can't quite tell what it is, but it sure looks familiar. It could be a batale, but I can't quite tell.
It's very low growing. The leaves, there's only about 2 or 3 leaves to a rosette. The biggest leaf is this one, which is about 8 inches long. The others are all roughly about 6 inches. I've got this flower. Take me a while to find that for you. So carry on.
Tony's response was that she thinks it could just be a juvenile batale, but we're not totally sure. If it's a juvenile batale, it's going to have a capitate inflorescence. So that'll tell you right away if it's a spiky type inflorescences. It's a bad term, but if it's that, it's in subgenus Sansevieria, and it could very well be a new species. Hard to say.
So somebody had just a general cultivation question, which was, how do you fertilize and how often?
We don't do a huge amount of fertilizing of our Sansevierias. Most of our fertilizing is the same as with everything else in our nursery, which is a high potassium fertilizer. We like that because it builds strong roots and it tends to act as a natural fungicide. So maybe that's one of the reasons why I have so few problems with Sansevierias growing them. I probably got the same problems with a lot of the Trifasciata cultivars that everybody has, because they're cultivars and they've been bred for variations in leaves. They tend to not have very good root structure to them, no matter what you do. So they have a tendency to rot out. But things with big rhizomes, we don't have any problem with them at all. We've done that so much that we've actually stopped growing some of those cultivars. It's the heat, humidity, and just how they're grown with the other plants that's a problem for us in Tucson. So we can't do it. Maybe in Florida, but there they have those same cultivars attacked by various fungi. So they're a problem. There's no question about it.
Somebody else asked, let's see if I can find it here. Oh yeah, they're just named B, so I don't know the whole name. But they asked, what botanical gardens have significant Sansevieria collections, if somebody wanted to go see one?
I'm trying to put all of our new species at Huntington, and I actually need to make another trip over there, assuming that COVID ever calms down in Southern California. I need to go over and drop some on John Traeger. I'm also depositing my holotypes now at Mobot in St. Louis, and I'm hoping that Mobot, the problem with Missouri Botanic Gardens is that they have to grow things in hothouses, and there's only so much room that they can sustain. So, I don't know how they're going to go into the future with that. Kew has got a living collection, but they've been destroying it. So unfortunately, if you go to Kew, you're not going to see very many interesting plants anymore. Certainly not what N.E. Brown saw when he made the first monograph on Sansevieria. So it's a bit desperate there, but Huntington, let's just go with the Huntington being that botanic garden for now.
And what about your greenhouse? I mean, that's your greenhouses. Is that a public place that people can go and see, or?
Oh yeah, I take people in. Well, there's 2 greenhouses. There's my home one, which if somebody really wanted to go see that, I mean, I've taken a number of people, Sansevieria people, to my home greenhouse, which is where most of the undescribed species are. But yeah, I take people around Airlands greenhouses all the time through the stock area. It's not a problem.
Mm-hmm. And how many types do you have there? If somebody came to the Airlands greenhouses, what could they see?
Oh, at least 75 species.
Wow.
A lot of cultivars.
There
A
are
lot of
probably not many
cultivars.
places where you can see that many. So
No, as I said in this talk, Alan Michaelbust and I have put a huge amount of energy into building a living collection of these plants for research purposes. So yeah, they're there, and you can see them.
and in case they didn't read the newsletter or the description, where is Arid Lands Greenhouses?
Oh, we're in Tucson, Arizona. Our nursery is out on the southwest side of town, and we see a lot of people dropping in, doing business with us. My home greenhouse is up in the Tucson mountains. I've been growing in that greenhouse for more than 25 years now, and I've recently decided to dedicate it to ground beds for Sansevierias. Somebody was asking about how to get them to flower. I'm starting to realize that if you put them into the ground here in Tucson, you get them into the ground and give them some root run, that's when you have your better chance of flowering. So I'm putting a lot of plants in the ground now.
So I actually have a personal question, because I was under the impression that I don't exactly want to call it a rosette, but each kind of stem part only blooms once. Is that right, or is that just a misconception that I had because they bloom so infrequently?
No, you're absolutely correct. Especially in the subgenus Sansevieria, that apical meristem, once you have a flower produced out of that, that's the end of it. It doesn't die, not monocarpic, but it will not grow anymore. So what you're seeing with flowering is that you're now going to put off offsets from the underground root system. It's different in subgenus capitatus. Those leaves will continue to grow because the flowers are actually coming off of the rootstock.
Oh, okay. Does anybody else?
I was going to
Jorge.
Yeah, I bought Sansevierias from Bob, to grow in the ground here in Monterey County in Salinas, and I think the subspecies, is that the name of it? Has done well a couple of winters now here with the rain at the ground. So my front yard, I'm getting confidence to put more of them, like Halle, the baseball one, in the ground. So kind of like one at a time.
Did you say subspicata?
Yeah, subspicata.
Yeah, subspicata we've had growing out in our ground for 25 years. Alan Michaelbust. What was that?
Well, that was the one you recommended, so I put it in the ground. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And it's funny because that's the one that's one of the most poorly known in the wild. So that's one that I'd really like to try and visit Mozambique and find the damn thing.
Yep. Thank you.
Well, Helen, our treasurer, was going to ask, and I think you did address this, but what's the best medium soil mix? I think you said just your general cactus mix works fine, or?
Yeah, we make it a little bit finer than the typical cactus mix. So for us, the finest we ever go for anything, that includes ficus and various Myrifera and Bursera, is generally around 50% organic material and 50% humus. And I would do something close to that for my Sansevierias. Keep in mind that doing that, we're also not watering very often. So if you were wanting to water very often, then you'd want to coarsen that mix up, or else you're going to possibly or almost definitely rot those plants out. Most of them are not from tropical climates. Most of them are from semi-arid to arid climates, so you have to bear that in mind. And sometimes with things like rare ones, like Sansevieria alensis, you need to keep that thing very tightly bound in a pot in order to prevent it from rotting out, because it is from a very arid place near Isle Somalia. So yeah, I have to know something about the plants. That's the thing, is that the great thing is the more you know about the plants, where they come from, you have a better chance of figuring out how to successfully grow them. And Jorge is saying that he grows them in clay soil. That would be very common along coastal Mozambique, which is where it's native to.
Great. Well, if anybody else has anything, go ahead. And I guess one person was asking how popular the Sansevieria is compared to the other genera that you sell.
They've really exploded in the last year or so in popularity. And I can't tell if that's simply because we keep increasing the number of things that we're offering, or if it's a general thing. I would guess it's a general increase in popularity. I just hope it's not a flash in the pan. But Sansevierias will not overcome some of our other groups of plants that we sell in terms of overall popularity in our business. It's not going to happen. But they're very, very popular right now.
I got another question.
Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, what's the smallest true species, not a dwarf variety, and what's the tallest?
Those are easy questions. Ilensis is clearly the smallest one. Sansevieria ilensis is also the rarest and most expensive and most difficult to grow. The tallest one is also clear. It's Sansevieria arborescent. And it may be a toss-up with arborescence, demotescent, and ascendant, but my ascendants are significantly shorter than my arborescent.
Do you sell both?
No, they go out the door almost as fast as we list them. Yeah, but I have demotescents and arborescents for sale right now. Ilensis, I've never sold Ilensis. I've given it away. Given away cuttings of it to people that I think are really good collectors who can grow it. But I really somehow I don't see myself ever selling Sansevieria ilensis.
And I guess I have one final question, which is, you may have told us the name of the one that was named after daggers, but if you were in a dark alley in a bad neighborhood late at night, which Sansevieria would you most like to have with you as a defensive weapon?
That's an easy question. Sansevieria downsii. Downsii is the most, oh man, that is just a brutal Sansevieria. It's from Malawi. Oh, it's a cylindrical one that is just sharp, and if you even look at it, it's gonna draw blood if you just look at it wrong.
All right. And the follow-up question is, who wins in a battle to the death, agave or Sansevieria?
Well, I've been bloodied by both of them too many times to count, so I'm not the guy to ask there. Then you could throw in euphorbias and aloes in the same equation, and
Right.
there will be blood.